The late afternoon sun poured through the floor-to-ceiling windows, turning the high-rise apartment into a cage of light. Mariah stood in the center of the living room, her gray maternity dress hanging loose around her swollen belly, the ultrasound photos clutched between trembling fingers. The paper felt too thin, too fragile, to hold the weight of what she was about to say. She had practiced this moment a dozen times. In her mind, it had always gone differently. Jung Yo-sun stood by the windows, his silhouette sharp against the sprawling city skyline. He was dressed in black, always black, the fabric stretched across his athletic frame like armor. Even from across the room, she could see the dark lines of his neck tattoos, the marks of a life he had never tried to hide from her. "Young-sun," she said, her voice barely cutting through the quiet. He turned, and for a heartbeat, his expression was unreadable. Not soft, but not yet hardened. "Just waiting. You asked me to come." She tried to sound steady, but her accent made the words feel heavier in her mouth, more vulnerable. He crossed the distance between them in measured steps, his movements controlled, deliberate. When he stopped in front of her, she could smell the faint trace of cigarette smoke clinging to his collar. His dark eyes searched her face, and she wondered if he could see how badly she was shaking. "What's wrong?" he asked. His voice was low, careful, the same voice that had once whispered her name in the dark like a prayer. This was the man she had fallen for. Not the boss. Not the legend whispered in hushed tones by those who feared him. Just Young-sun, the man who had held her through sleepless nights, who had promised she would always be safe with him. "I need to show you something," she said. His jaw tightened, just slightly. "You're scaring me." She almost laughed. The idea that she could scare him seemed impossible. But her hands were already moving, lifting the ultrasound photos toward him like an offering, like something sacred she was afraid to break. "I'm pregnant," she whispered. He took the photos slowly. His fingers brushed against hers, warm and familiar, and for one desperate second she let herself hope. She watched his face, searching for the reaction she had imagined 100 times. Surprise, confusion, maybe even joy. The silence stretched. His eyes moved over the images once, then again. The muscle in his jaw jumped. The warmth drained from his expression so completely it felt like watching a door lock from the inside. Something cold and absolute slid into place behind his gaze. "Mariah," he said quietly. Her heart began to pound. "It's yours," she said quickly, the words rushing out before she could stop them. "Young-sun, it's ours." He didn't look up. His fingers tightened on the photos, knuckles going white. "This baby," he said slowly, each word carved from ice, "is not mine." The ground beneath her tilted. "What?" He finally raised his eyes to hers, and the tenderness was gone. What remained was something she had seen only once before, in the split second before violence erupted. Control. Certainty. Judgment. "You think I'm a fool?" His voice was rising now, filling the vast apartment. "I trusted you. I brought you into my world. I protected you. And this is how you repay me." "It's yours," she whispered, but the words came out broken, powerless against the force of his rage. "It's not." He took a step toward her, veins bulging along his neck, the dark lines of his tattoos shifting with each breath. "Do you understand what you're asking me to believe? That I'm the father of a baby I can't have?" His hand swept across the nearby table, sending a glass vase crashing to the floor. The sound made her jump, made her hand fly instinctively to her stomach. 5 years ago, a rival syndicate came for me. They didn't kill me, but they made sure I'd never have children. The doctors confirmed it. Tests. Scans. Medical certainty. He was close now, and she could see his chest heaving, the white-knuckled fists at his sides. "So tell me, Mariah," he said, his voice dropping to something low and dangerous, "whose baby is it really?" "Yours," she said again, tears streaming down her face now, her voice desperate. "Young-sun, I swear, there's no one else. There's never been anyone else." "Liar." The word hit her like a physical blow. She stumbled back, her shoulders hitting the window behind her, the cold glass pressing against her spine. "Please," she begged. "Please just listen." "I am listening." His face twisted with betrayal and rage. "I'm listening to you stand here and tell me the impossible. I'm listening to you insult my intelligence." Then, slowly and deliberately, he began to tear. The first ultrasound ripped in half. The sound was soft, just paper against paper, but it exploded in her head like a scream. He tore again. And again. White pieces fell between them, drifting down like snow, landing on the polished floor at her feet. "You come into my home," he said, his voice shaking with fury. "You lie to my face." "No," her voice broke. He bent down, scooping up the torn pieces from the floor. For one brief, foolish moment, she thought he might be reconsidering, that he might piece them back together. Instead, he walked to the fireplace and threw them in. The white fragments curled and blackened in the flames, disappearing into ash. "Get out of my sight," he said, his back still to her, his voice suddenly empty. "And if I ever see you again, you won't walk away." Mariah stood paralyzed, her entire body trembling, watching the last traces of proof burn away to nothing. The afternoon sun still poured through the windows, indifferent and bright, illuminating the wreckage of everything she'd believed in. Behind him, the city stretched out bright and uncaring, the skyline gleaming in the afternoon sun, beautiful and cruel and utterly indifferent. She didn't remember deciding to move. She only remembered her legs finally obeying, carrying her toward the door, away from the man she loved, away from the flames consuming her future. "Stop. Right there. You just watched a pregnant woman get thrown out by the man she loves. You felt that, didn't you? That sick feeling in your stomach? Good. Because here's what's going to happen if you don't subscribe right now, you're going to abandon her too. Just like he did. You'll close this video, scroll to something easier, something that doesn't make you feel this much, and you'll never know if she survives. If the baby makes it. If he ever realizes what he's done. And 6 months from now, when you can't sleep because you're wondering what happened to Mariah, you'll have no one to blame but yourself. 2 seconds. Hit subscribe. Or admit you're exactly like Yong-sun, someone who walks away when things get real. Inside the high-rise apartment, Jung Yong-sun stood perfectly still. The torn pieces of the ultrasound lay scattered across the floor, a few fragments the flames had missed, white against dark marble. For a long moment, he didn't move. His chest rose and fell, slow and controlled. Anger was easy. Anger was familiar. Anger had always been his first language. But this wasn't just anger. This was something else. Something colder, sharper, pressing against his ribs like a warning he couldn't hear yet. A memory tried to surface, doctors, white coats, clinical voices telling him things he'd chosen not to question. He crushed it down. She had betrayed him. The evidence was clear. He turned back to the windows, to the city spread out below him like a kingdom under his control. Everything here answered to him. Everything except the doubt beginning to whisper in the back of his mind. Everything except the image of her face, pale and terrified, burned into his vision like something he would never be able to tear apart. The elevator descended in silence, but Mariah's heartbeat filled her ears like thunder. She kept her eyes fixed on the glowing numbers above the door, watching them drop floor by floor, taking her further from the penthouse and closer to a world where she had no protection, no name, no power. The doors opened to the lobby. She stepped out, forcing her legs to move at a normal pace, forcing her face to stay blank even though her chest felt like it was caving in. The polished marble stretched before her, vast and gleaming, reflecting her small, trembling figure back at herself. The doorman by the entrance straightened when he saw her. His eyes tracked her movement across the floor, neutral but watching. Always watching. Did he know? Had Yong-sun already made a call? Another guard stood near the elevator bank, his hand resting casually near his waist. He nodded once as she passed, his expression giving nothing away, but she felt the weight of his gaze follow her like a hand on her shoulder. They all knew who she was, who she belonged to, or who she used to belong to. Her fingers tightened around the strap of her purse, her only possession now, as she pushed through the glass doors and into the late afternoon heat. The sunlight hit her face, blinding after the cool darkness of the lobby, and for a moment she stood frozen on the sidewalk. People moved around her in steady streams, office workers heading home, tourists with cameras, couples holding hands. The city pulsed with life, indifferent to the fact that hers had just ended. She started walking. 1 block, then another. She didn't know where she was going, only that she needed distance, needed to disappear into the crowd before someone decided to follow. At the third intersection, she glanced back. A man in a dark jacket stood at the corner behind her, his phone to his ear, his eyes scanning the street. Her breath caught. It could be nothing. It could be anyone. She turned sharply down a side street, her pace quickening. Her hand pressed against her stomach, feeling the slight swell there, the tiny life depending on her to be smart, to be careful, to survive. The subway entrance appeared ahead like salvation. She hurried down the stairs, the cool underground air rising to meet her, thick with the smell of metal and exhaust and humanity. The platform was crowded, bodies pressed together, faces she didn't recognize, voices speaking languages she only half understood. She pushed deeper into the crowd, letting herself be swallowed by strangers. A train arrived with a rush of wind and screaming brakes. She stepped inside just as the doors began to close, wedging herself between a businessman and a woman with shopping bags. Through the window, she watched the platform slide away. The man in the dark jacket stood at the top of the stairs, searching. Then the tunnel swallowed the train, and he disappeared. Mariah exhaled, her whole body shaking now, the adrenaline draining out of her all at once. She gripped the metal pole to stay upright as the train rocked through the darkness. She was alone. Completely, terrifyingly alone. Do you realize what just happened? You just watched a pregnant woman run for her life through subway stations because the man who was supposed to protect her became her biggest threat. And you're still here, which means you care. But caring isn't enough. If you don't subscribe to this channel right now, you're complicit in something I need you to understand. Stories like this die in silence. Real stories. Painful stories. Stories that show you what love looks like when it's betrayed, what strength looks like when you have nothing left. The algorithm doesn't care about content that makes you cry. It cares about content that makes you click. And unless you subscribe, unless you tell YouTube this matters to me, then the next story like this won't reach anyone. And someone who needed it, someone who's alone like Mariah, they'll stay alone. Don't let that be your legacy. Subscribe. Hit the bell. Be the reason these stories survive. And somewhere above her, in a penthouse that touched the sky, the man who had promised to protect her had become the thing she needed protection from. The apartment was too quiet. Young-sun stood at the windows, staring out at the city as the sun began its slow descent toward the horizon. The skyline blazed with golden light, buildings catching fire in the dying day, beautiful and relentless and mocking. He had built this life. Clawed his way up from the streets where men died for looking at the wrong person the wrong way. Every scar on his body told a story of survival. Every tattoo marked a victory, a loss, a line crossed that couldn't be uncrossed. And now this. Betrayal in his own home. His jaw clenched. He could still see her face, pale and frightened, tears streaming down her cheeks as she begged him to believe the impossible. The memory made his hands curl into fists. She had seemed so genuine. That was what made it worse. He turned away from the windows, from the light that felt like an accusation. The apartment stretched around him, vast and empty, filled with expensive furniture and silence. No voices. No laughter. No Mariah humming off-key in the kitchen while she tried to cook Korean food she'd learned from YouTube. The fireplace had burned down to embers now, the flames reduced to a dull red glow. His eyes caught on something white near the edge of the hearth. A scrap of paper, a small piece that had escaped the fire when he'd thrown the rest in. He crossed the room slowly and crouched down, picking it up between 2 fingers. It was a corner of one of the ultrasound photos. Just a fragment, mostly black and white static, but in the upper edge he could make out part of a tiny shape. A curve. Maybe a head. Maybe nothing. He stared at it, his thumb brushing across the glossy surface. For a brief, treacherous moment, something shifted in his chest. Something that felt dangerously close to doubt. What if? He crushed the thought immediately, violently, the way he learned to crush any weakness that threatened to break through. Doubt got men killed in his world. Doubt made you hesitate when hesitation meant a bullet. The doctors had been clear. 5 years ago, after the rival gang had finished with him, after the surgeries and the infections and the brutal recovery, they had told him in clinical terms that fatherhood was not in his future. He'd seen the scans himself. He'd accepted it as the price of survival. This baby couldn't be his. She had betrayed him. The evidence was absolute. He looked down at the scrap of photo in his hand, at the tiny curve that might have been his child's head, and felt nothing but the cold certainty that had kept him alive this long. He walked to the trash bin near the kitchen and dropped it in. The white fragment disappeared among the refuse, joining the coffee grounds and yesterday's newspaper and all the other things that didn't matter. But when he turned away, heading toward his bedroom where sleep wouldn't come, he found himself listening to the silence. Found himself noticing the empty space where her voice should have been. Found himself seeing her face again, not with the calculating expression of a liar, but with the raw terror of someone telling a truth no one would believe. He poured himself a drink and tried to drown the image. It didn't work. The apartment was on the 4th floor of a building that smelled like mildew and old cooking oil. No elevator. The stairs creaked under Mariah's weight, and the hallway light flickered every few seconds like it was deciding whether to give up entirely. The landlord had barely looked at her before taking her cash deposit. No questions. No lease. Just a key and a curt nod toward the door at the end of the hall. Inside, the space was smaller than Yongsun's closet had been. A single room with a kitchenette wedged into one corner, a bathroom the size of a coffin, and a window that looked out onto a brick wall 3 feet away. The walls were water-stained, the floor uneven, and something was dripping somewhere she couldn't see. But it was hers. And more importantly, it was invisible. Mariah set her purse on the floor and sat on the thin mattress that came with the room. The springs groaned beneath her. She pressed both hands against her belly, feeling the tautness there, and tried not to think about the penthouse, about floor-to-ceiling windows and marble floors, and the way morning light used to pour across the bed. That life was gone. The first week was the hardest. She ventured out only when necessary, keeping her head down, avoiding eye contact. At the convenience store, she pointed at items because the words wouldn't come, her limited Korean crumbling under the weight of fear and exhaustion. The clerk had been patient at first, then annoyed, finally just ringing up her purchases in silence. She counted her money every night. Bills and coins spread across the mattress in neat piles. She calculated how long it would last. Not long enough. She tried applying for jobs, but every form asked for documentation she didn't have, references she couldn't provide. Her work visa was tied to Yongsun's sponsorship, and she couldn't use it without alerting him to her location. At night, lying on the lumpy mattress with traffic sounds filtering through the thin walls, she felt the loneliness like a physical weight pressing down on her chest. Then the baby moved. It was subtle at first, a flutter low in her belly that she almost missed. Then it came again, stronger, like a tiny fist pushing against her palm. Mariah's breath caught. She placed both hands over the spot and waited. There. Another movement. A roll, maybe, or a kick. "Hi," she whispered into the dark room. Her voice cracked on the single syllable. The baby shifted again, as if in response. Something broke open in her chest, something that had been locked tight since she'd fled the penthouse. Not hope exactly. Not yet. But something close to it. Something that felt like purpose. I know, she said softly, tears sliding down her temples into her hair. I know you're scared. I'm scared too. Another kick, firmer this time. But I'm going to keep you safe. I promise. Whatever it takes. The baby moved again, and Mariah closed her eyes, anchoring herself to that feeling. To the proof that she wasn't alone. That someone needed her. That she had to be stronger than she'd ever been before. Outside, the city hummed with life that had forgotten her. But inside this small, broken room, she was building something new. The meeting room was thick with cigarette smoke and tension. Young-sun sat at the head of the table, listening to reports about shipments and territory disputes, his mind only half present. The past 3 weeks had blurred together, each day the same as the last, efficient and empty. He hadn't looked for her. Hadn't asked questions. What would be the point? Boss. One of his lieutenants, Kim, was speaking. The payment from the south side came through. No issues. Young-sun nodded, dismissing the information. Also, Kim hesitated, glancing at the others around the table. Your cousin called. Said he wants to see you. Tell him I'm busy. He was insistent. Said it was family business. Young-sun's joy tightened. Family business usually meant his aunt was meddling again, trying to set him up with some suitable woman from a suitable family who would give him suitable heirs. The irony wasn't lost on him. Fine. Send him up after we're done here. 20 minutes later, Young-sun's cousin Min-sik stood in the penthouse, looking uncomfortable in his pressed suit. He'd always been the soft one, the one who'd gone to university instead of into the family business. The one who asked questions. What do you want? Young-sun poured himself a drink, not offering one to his cousin. I heard about Mariah, Min-sik said quietly. Young-sun's hand stilled on the glass. That's none of your concern. Aunt told me. She said Mariah claimed she was pregnant. Claimed being the operative word. Min-sik was quiet for a moment, watching him. You were certain? That it wasn't yours? Completely. Young-sun downed the drink, feeling the burn. The doctors were clear 5 years ago. I can't have children. But you never had follow-up tests. The words hung in the air like smoke. Young-sun turned slowly. What? After the initial diagnosis, Min-sik said carefully, did you ever go back? Get retested. Why would I? The damage was done. Bodies heal sometimes. Min-sik shifted his weight, uncomfortable but persistent. I read about a case last month. A man who'd been told the same thing. Trauma, infection, permanent damage. 10 years later, his wife got pregnant. The doctors called it a miracle, but it wasn't. It was just rare recovery. Something cold slid down Young-sun's spine. That's not the same situation. Maybe not. Min-sik held his gaze. But you threw her out based on absolute certainty. I'm just asking, was it absolute? Or was it just what you were told once, years ago, when you were too angry to ask questions? Young-sun felt his hands curl into fists. The memory of Mariah's face surfaced, uninvited. The way she'd looked at him, desperate and truthful, swearing there had been no one else. Get out, he said quietly. Hyung. Get out. Min-sik left without another word, but the damage was done. Young-sun stood alone in the penthouse, staring at nothing. The city lights blurred beyond the windows. His mind was racing now, pulling up memories he'd buried. The doctors had used words like unlikely and extremely improbable. Had they ever said impossible? He couldn't remember. The doubt wormed its way in, small and vicious, whispering questions he didn't want to answer. What if Min-sik was right? What if his body had healed? What if the baby was his, and he'd thrown away the only woman who'd ever looked at him like he was more than a monster? Young-sun reached for his phone, then stopped. He needed to know. Not for her. For himself. He needed absolute certainty, one way or the other, before the doubt consumed him completely. The private clinic was empty at 2 in the morning. Yong-sun had made sure of that. He sat in the sterile examination room, the fluorescent lights humming overhead, while Dr. Choi pulled up files on his computer screen. The older man's hands trembled slightly as he typed, whether from being woken at midnight or from fear, Yong-sun couldn't tell. Didn't care. Here, Dr. Choi said, adjusting his glasses. Your records from 5 years ago. Yong-sun stared at the screen, at the clinical language that had once seemed so final. Severe trauma. Extensive scarring. Compromised function. Read it to me, he said. Every word. Dr. Choi cleared his throat. Following surgical intervention for traumatic injury, patient exhibits significant impairment of reproductive function. Sperm count is severely diminished. Motility substantially reduced. Prognosis for natural conception is. He paused. Extremely poor. Poor, Yong-sun repeated. Not impossible. Well, medically speaking, we rarely use the word impossible. Did you tell me it was impossible? Dr. Choi shifted in his chair. You were in significant pain at the time. The likelihood of recovery was minimal. For all practical purposes. Answer the question. The exact phrasing in my notes was functionally infertile. But Mr. Jung, you have to understand the degree of damage. Can bodies recover? The silence stretched for 3 heartbeats. In rare cases, Dr. Choi said quietly yes. Tissue can regenerate. Function can partially restore itself over time, especially in younger patients with good overall health. The floor seemed to tilt beneath Yong-sun's feet. How rare? Very. Perhaps 1 in 1,000 cases. Maybe fewer. But it's documented. I can show you studies. Did you ever test me again? After the initial diagnosis, Dr. Choi's face paled. You never came back for follow-up appointments. I sent reminders, but... So you don't actually know. Yong-sun's voice was deadly calm. You diagnosed me 5 years ago and never checked if anything changed. Mr. Jung, the likelihood was so small. Test me now. It's the middle of the night. Yong-sun stood, and the movement was enough. Dr. Choi flinched, nodding quickly. Of course. Right away. The next 2 hours passed in a blur of needles and specimen cups and the clinical efficiency of a man trying to save his own life by doing his job. Yong-sun sat in the waiting room, staring at nothing, his mind replaying every moment of that day in the penthouse. The way she'd trembled. The way she'd sworn there was no one else. The absolute terror in her eyes when he'd torn the photos apart. When Dr. Choi finally returned, his face was ashen. The results are preliminary, but... He swallowed hard. Your sperm count is low, but viable. Motility is present. It's not impossible. Natural conception would still be difficult, but it could happen. The words landed like bullets. You're saying I could be a father. I'm saying you could have been. If Dr. Choi stopped himself. Yong-sun didn't need him to finish. If the woman was telling the truth. If the baby was his. If he hadn't destroyed everything based on certainty that was never certain at all. He walked out of the clinic into the pre-dawn darkness, and for the first time in 15 years, Jung Yong-sun felt something he'd thought he'd burned out of himself long ago. Shame. Finding her took less than 6 hours. Yong-sun made a single phone call, and by morning, he had an address in a neighborhood he owned but never visited. The kind of place where people didn't ask questions because they already knew the answers wouldn't help them. He sat in the back of a car across the street from her building, watching the entrance. The guilt sat heavy in his chest, a weight he couldn't shift no matter how many times he told himself he'd been protecting himself, protecting his empire, protecting the certainty that had kept him alive. All he'd protected was his pride. At 9 in the morning, she emerged. Even from a distance, he could see how she'd changed. The gray dress was gone, replaced by clothes that hung loose and worn. She moved carefully, one hand resting on her belly, which had grown noticeably rounder. She looked tired. Thin. Alone. Everything he'd made her. She disappeared into the subway station, and he didn't follow. What would he say? How could he explain that his certainty had been arrogance, that his rage had been fear, that he'd burned their future to ash because he was too proud to question a diagnosis from 5 years ago? Instead, he made different calls. By that afternoon, word had spread through every corner of the underworld he controlled. The message was simple, delivered in the kind of tone that made men remember why they feared him. Mariah Morton is untouchable. Anyone who harms her, follows her, or even looks at her too long answers to me personally. The order rippled outward like a stone in dark water. He found her landlord next. The man was a weasel who charged twice what the apartment was worth and ignored every complaint about broken heating and leaking pipes. Yong-sun didn't introduce himself, just left an envelope thick with cash and instructions that her rent was paid for the next year. Any maintenance issues were to be fixed immediately. Any questions would be answered by someone the landlord didn't want to meet. The medical bills were harder to track. She'd been avoiding hospitals, probably afraid of leaving a paper trail, but she'd visited a clinic twice. Yong-sun paid the outstanding balance and set up an anonymous account to cover future visits. Prenatal care. Delivery. Whatever she needed. He told himself it wasn't enough. It would never be enough. But it was all he could do from the shadows, because showing his face would only remind her of the worst moment of her life. Of his hands tearing apart proof of their child. Of his voice calling her a liar when she'd been telling the truth. 3 weeks passed. Then 4. He received reports, brief, factual updates that told him she was healthy, that she was managing, that she was surviving. She went to the clinic for a checkup. The report said the baby was growing normally. His baby. Their baby. Yong-sun sat in his penthouse that night, the city glittering below him like a kingdom that suddenly felt worthless. He'd built an empire on control and fear and absolute certainty. He'd made men bow and rivals disappear and money flow like water. And he'd thrown away the only thing that had ever been real. He couldn't undo what he'd done. Couldn't take back the words or the violence or the betrayal. But he could make sure she was safe. Make sure she never had to struggle or fear or look over her shoulder. It was penance, not redemption. He knew the difference. The first contraction hit at 3 a.m, stealing Mariah's breath and pulling her from sleep. She lay there in the darkness, one hand pressed against her belly, counting seconds until the pain ebbed. It was too early. She had 2 more weeks. The second contraction came 20 minutes later, stronger, unmistakable. She sat up slowly, her heart pounding, and looked around the small apartment that had become her refuge. The hospital bag she'd packed sat by the door, prepared weeks ago because being ready was the only control she had left. Another contraction. 15 minutes this time. She was alone. Completely alone. No one to call, no one to hold her hand, no one to tell her it would be okay. Her phone sat on the nightstand, and before she could stop herself, before logic could intervene, her fingers were moving across the screen. She found his number, the one she'd never deleted, and typed 3 words. Baby is coming. She hit send before she could change her mind. The response came in seconds. Where are you? She sent the hospital address, then grabbed her bag and stumbled down the stairs into the night. Yong-sun's phone had been on his nightstand, face up, for 3 months. He'd been waiting without admitting he was waiting, hoping without letting himself hope. When it lit up with her message, he was moving before his mind caught up. The hospital was across the city. He made it in 12 minutes, breaking every traffic law, his driver too smart to question. The emergency entrance glowed harsh and sterile in the pre-dawn darkness. He found out which floor, which wing, which room. His name, his reputation, could have opened any door. Could have gotten him past the nurses, past the protocols, straight to her side. He stopped in the hallway outside labor and delivery. Through the small window in the door, he could see movement. Nurses, equipment, the organized chaos of birth. Somewhere in that room, Mariah was in pain, bringing their child into the world, and he was the reason she'd done it alone for 9 months. He had no right to enter. A nurse emerged, nearly colliding with him. She looked up, startled, then recognized something in his face that made her expression soften. "Are you the father?" The word hit him like a physical blow. "Yes. You can go in." "She needs." "No." His voice was rough. "Not unless she asks for me." The nurse frowned. "Sir, your partner is in active labor." "I know." He stepped back from the door, positioning himself against the wall where he could see the entrance, but stay out of the way. "I'll be right here. If she wants me, tell her I'm here. If she doesn't, I understand." The hours crawled past. Nurses came and went. Doctors consulted. Through the door, he heard sounds that tore at him, Mariah's voice, strained with pain, calling out. Not for him. Never for him. He stayed against the wall, his legs aching, his body tense with the need to burst through the door and fix things he had no power to fix. Dawn broke through the hospital windows, pale gray light filling the corridor. Then, finally, a different sound. Sharp and piercing and unmistakable. A baby's cry. Yongsun's legs nearly gave out. He pressed his back harder against the wall, his hands shaking, his vision blurring. His child. His daughter or son. Alive. Real. The door opened. A nurse stepped out, saw him still standing there, and something like respect crossed her face. "It's a girl," she said softly. "Both mother and baby are healthy. Can I?" His voice broke. He cleared his throat and tried again. "Can I see them? Let me ask." She disappeared inside. Yongsun waited, every second an eternity, knowing he would accept whatever answer came back. Knowing he deserved nothing. The nurse returned. She says yes. Wait. Before he walks through that door, before you get the ending you've been waiting for, I need to tell you something that's going to make you uncomfortable. You've been here for 40 minutes. You've cried. You've judged him. You've rooted for her. You've invested your time, your attention, your emotions into this story. And here's the truth you don't want to hear. That's the same logic Yongsun used. I'll believe her if she proves it. I'll trust her if she earns it. And look what that cost him. 9 months of his daughter's life. The woman he loves, terrified and alone. Everything gone because he waited for certainty before he acted. So I'm asking you, are you going to make the same mistake? Are you going to wait until it's convenient, until you're sure, until you've taken everything this story has to give before you decide it was worth your time? Or are you going to act right now? Subscribe. Hit the notification bell. Choose to be someone who recognizes value and honors it immediately. Because the ending is 30 seconds away, and I need to know, are you Yongsun before the clinic or after? Choose. Yongsun stepped into the room like a man entering a church, quietly, reverently, stripped of everything that had once made him powerful. Mariah lay in the hospital bed, exhausted and pale, her hair damp with sweat. In her arms, wrapped in a pink blanket, was a tiny being with dark hair and skin that glowed like warm honey in the morning light. The baby's eyes were closed, her small fist curled against Mariah's chest. He stopped just inside the door, unable to move further. "Come closer," Mariah said. Her voice was hoarse, worn thin by hours of labor and 9 months of carrying the weight alone. He moved forward slowly, each step feeling like a confession. When he reached the bedside, his eyes caught on something that made his breath stop. On the small table, carefully arranged, were the torn pieces of the ultrasound photos. Someone had taped them back together, the strips of clear tape holding the fragments in place like scars that would never fully heal. The image was fractured but whole, showing the tiny shape of the child he'd refused to believe existed. She'd kept them. After everything, she'd kept them. "Her name is Jiwoo," Mariah said quietly. "It means wisdom and grace. I thought if you ever came back, you'd want her to have a Korean name." The words broke something fundamental in him. Yongsun dropped to his knees beside the bed, the movement sudden and complete, every ounce of pride draining from his body. His hands came up to his face, and for the first time since he was a child, since before violence had become his language, he wept. "I'm sorry." The words came out strangled, barely human. "Mariah, I'm so sorry. I destroyed us. I destroyed everything because I was too arrogant to question myself, too afraid to believe something good could happen to someone like me." Mariah watched him cry, her expression unreadable, exhausted beyond emotion. "I paid for your apartment," he continued, the words tumbling out between broken breaths. "Your medical bills. I made sure no one in the city would touch you. I know it doesn't fix anything. I know it doesn't come close to what I took from you, but I need you to know I've been protecting you. From the shadows. Because I didn't deserve to stand in the light." "I know," she said softly. He looked up, shocked. "The landlord suddenly fixing things. The clinic saying my bills were covered. I figured it out." She adjusted Jiwoo in her arms, and the baby made a small sound. "I wasn't sure if I should be grateful or angry." "Be angry," he said immediately. "I deserve your anger. I deserve worse." Mariah was quiet for a long moment, looking down at their daughter. "She has your eyes," she finally said. When she opened them earlier, they were dark. "Like yours." Yongsun's chest tightened. He looked at the baby, really looked, and saw his own features reflected in miniature. The curve of her brow. The shape of her tiny nose. "Can I?" He couldn't finish the question. Mariah shifted slightly, extending her arms. "Support her head." He rose from his knees just enough to take Jiwoo into his arms, his hands shaking so badly he was afraid he'd drop her. The baby weighed nothing and everything at once. She stirred against his chest, her small body warm and alive and impossibly fragile. "I will spend the rest of my life making this right," he whispered, his voice breaking. "I will be the father she deserves. The partner you deserved. I will earn this, Mariah. Every day. However long it takes." Mariah's eyes filled with tears. "It's going to take a long time. I know. And I can't promise I'll ever forget what you did. I don't want you to forget." He looked at her, his face wet, raw, completely exposed. "I just want the chance to prove I can be better." She reached out slowly, her hand touching the taped-together ultrasound on the table. "Then start now," she said.